The Jack Dapper Blues Heritage Preservation Foundation is committed to serving the community through public programs that honor blues, Black American folklore, oral history, education, and cultural preservation and conservation. But this work takes funding to operate. You could support the mission through our courses, workshops, and by becoming an underwriting or sponsorship partner. Help us keep this work breathing for our people and by our people. What's happening? What's happening? And again, what's happening, good people? Welcome to the first episode and edition of a new part of the Jack Dapper Blues radio show. We speak about it often. I've done lives about it, and series about it as it pertains to blues ecology, blues people, blues narrative, and the belief and the practice and the engagement of the people in their connection to the land. But I thought it would make sense and even help to specifically carve out a space to discuss Black folk belief in the blues landscape. So welcome to our very first episode, and our guest for today in this episode, I think, is the one of the primary people to start this, Mr. Dr. Tony Kail, a cultural anthropologist, author, educator, and researcher whose work has helped bring greater public understanding to the history and meaning of hoodoo in the Mid-South. He is the author of A Secret History of Memphis Hoodoo and Stories of Rootworkers and Hoodoo in the Mid-South. And he is connected to the Beale Street Hoodoo History and Folklife Museum, a space dedicated to exploring the rich heritage of African American spiritual healing, root work, and conjure traditions in Memphis, which I have to go see. You all need to go down there. Through his writing, fieldwork, and public scholarship, Tony Kail has worked to separate fact from fiction by showing that hoodoo is not about sensational myths, curses, or devil worship, but rather a survival-based system of African-derived spiritual knowledge, healing, protection, and cultural continuity. His work highlights the men and women who carry these traditions through slavery, segregation, and the long history of racial misunderstandings, while honoring the families and communities who have preserved this knowledge across generations. The Beale Street Hoodoo History and Folklife Museum reflects that same commitment. Its mission is to educate the public about the secret history of hoodoo culture in Memphis and the broader Mid-South, while remaining accountable to the communities and tradition bearers represented in its exhibits. In this conversation, we look to explore the history, folklore, misconceptions, singular and plural, and living legacy of hoodoo, as well as the importance of documenting and honoring African American healing traditions in Memphis and throughout the Delta, not just the Mississippi Delta, but the actual Delta. Let's give it up for Dr. Kail.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining me. I was telling you off air. I don't know how if you caught any of my lives, particularly last season, last year up until the summer, because I reference um one of the specific books is the stories of root workers and hoodoo in the Mid South. I have a slew of books, but for me, the way kind of how I operate, there's certain I have like a million books, but out of that million, there's like 5 to 10 books per uh, topic, if you will, that are my go tos, and that is one of my go tos. I think particularly the story. I think this happened. It happened in the 30s. I want to say 37. Uh, when the police were going to this house that was a medical facility slash uh, spiritual practitioner's home to bust it because they were practicing. Um, and that kind of stuff, that story, and I hate to call it a story, but that example, I should say, even better, it is one, the perfect place to start with you on this conversation, but two, for me, it was a perfect visual and example of not only the misunderstanding, but the intersectionality and functionality of the belief, culture, tradition, and practice of healing, right? Uh, what got you into this first? Let's start there. What got you into this?
So, growing up, when I was a kid, my parents would take me onto Beale Street to A Schwab. And, A Schwab, we're the oldest continuing business in Memphis, then the oldest business on Beale Street, where this year will be 150 years old.
Mm,
And when I was a kid, I would go in and see all these candles and powders and oils, and I really had no idea what it was about. I wasn't raised around it. I wasn't familiar about it, but it really stuck with me. And years later, when we moved to another area in West Tennessee, I became friends with a guy whose grandmother was said to be a spiritual healer. And so he would tell me, she doesn't take money. She does this because she loves people and she believes she has this gift. And this is what it is, a gift. It's something that's given away. It's not purchased. And so I would go and spend time with her, and her name was Miss Jessie, and she was a amazing woman. And she would pray for folks, lay hands on folks. She would concoct remedies for folks, and and I knew it was important, but I didn't grasp the big picture of why this was important. But I knew it was enough that I needed to document her stories and spend some time with her and see what she had to teach me. And so as years went by, I became I had developed a love for Africa, and had actually gone to Africa a couple of times and done some work with an NGO there. And I fell in love with Africa, and I fell in love with African spiritual traditions and healing traditions there. And while I was there, I met a traditional healer, and there were so many things that he had and did that was so reminiscent of what Miss Jessie did. The use of herbs, the recognition and acknowledgement of the importance of ancestors, the being available to the community, and the big focus being able to provide a sense of equipping the community for survival. And whether that be through physical hardships like disease and sickness, or through spiritual hardships that may occur, that what little bit of medical care was available there addressed strictly the biological physical aspects and did not necessarily address the spiritual aspects. So this became an area where traditional healing was very important. And so through the years, I started doing research on um, hoodoo in the Mid-South. And it was really strange because it was like turning a stone over, and another stone would turn over and another stone would turn over. And then all of a sudden, we're faced with this. There is this, years and years of history, years and years of culture. And in the midst of this, there were wars against the traditional systems of healing and spirituality, to the fact that there were police campaigns, to the fact that there were campaigns from Western medical physicians against it. And this story just started accumulating more and more. And I would start finding out not only was this something that happened, around many areas in the southern U.S., but specifically our area of Memphis was a home to a number of prolific healers, a number of prolific root workers, and all these histories started coming together. And there was a point where I felt like I was shown this lineage of not only the tradition itself going back to Africa, but a lineage of history that just built upon, survival, oppression, survival, oppression. And so, in the face of what Hollywood and a lot of pop culture would tell us about hoodoo, that the reality was that hoodoo was not about spells and curses and some sort of pagan worship, but was about survival. And it was about um, those who are the torchbearers of this tradition. And that, this is a history that we were never taught growing up. And I have, friends that are in the Black community that say they were never taught this growing up, that they may have been exposed to the culture, that they may even have been raised in families where practices were done, but there wasn't necessarily this ongoing historical narrative available to talk about what happened and the importance of hoodoo and the importance of the events that we've seen historically. And I feel like now more than ever, we need to understand these stories of the past, to learn from them, to make sure they never happen again, and
Mm-hmm.
to build bridges of understanding where these areas occur, because it still affects how a lot of society views African traditions. And in some cases, even how the state interacts with aspects relating to African traditions. So it came to a point where I was able to put this in book form, and I started building a small traveling museum. And when I would go lecture, I would bring some of the different items. And, I think back to a presentation I did at the West Tennessee Delta Heritage Center years ago. And and I had some of the different items out, some of the different curios and some photographs of some famous healers. And I'll never forget, there was a couple who came in, and they walked up to the table, and they were looking at some of the photographs and materials. And this lady said, "Oh, that's all that old superstitious stuff. That's that stuff. Oh yeah, that's superstitious stuff." Well, by the end of the presentation, she came up and she goes, "My grandmother did mop the steps with urine." I said, "Did she now?" "Oh yeah, and when you sweep away." And I said, "But that's that old superstition stuff, right?"
Right.
She said, "Oh." I said, yeah. I said, that's the worldview that we have been taught, that it is that old superstition stuff. But in reality is a very honorable ancestral tradition that is passed on and preserved, and is a tool for survival.
Well, so you gave me quite a bit to unpack,
Yes, sir.
which is good. But there's one aspect of it that I kind of want to start there. The location, Memphis, right? There's a lot that kind of seems to be, or that situates Memphis as a central location because it's like it's right next to it's a you cross the street and you're in Mississippi.
That's right.
Right, literally, right. So I'm wondering what the location of Memphis and these practices and the idea of Memphis Mini doing a lot of songs talking about, what is this location, or how, why is it why is it a central place for this sort of practice? Would you happen to know?
Well, historically, beginning, of course, with Africans who were taken from their homes and brought down the Mississippi. It's fascinating. We read early reports of DeSoto bringing Africans on boats down the Mississippi, in the area where the Mississippi River meets sort of the bluff there in Memphis was a sacred area to indigenous people here already. And so you had that recognition of the river being sacred, and you had that proximity of the river and the steamboats coming in. And so as slavery sort of took a hold in the South, you started seeing families that some that had been brought from Africa and some that had been brought from Africa, but taken to places like Virginia first, and then brought to areas of the Mid-South. And so you had this culmination of families that needed these tools of survival. And I think it was Brother Roboto's, if I'm pronouncing his last name right, his use of the term the invisible institution of where this was this healing system that was available when there wasn't medicine or good medicine anyway available to those working on plantations, available to those that were enslaved. And so the traditional healer played that counselor, that doctor, that therapist. And so we had that invisible institution building. And I think that it stayed remnant in the dirt. And there's something, and this kind of goes over into a philosophical aspect of it, but there's something in the mud of Memphis. There's something in the ground of Memphis. I've had people from all over the world that I've talked to that have visited Memphis, that for lack of a better term, they are very spiritually tuned, and they have communicated that there is such an energy, such a power in Memphis. And as you said, we've got the river on one side, we've got Mississippi on the other side. And so we've got this deep lineage of these traditions in Memphis. And Memphis was almost like an incubator for a lot of the tradition. There was, starting as far back as 1866, I think, was our first mention of hoodoo in Memphis in the media reports. And so we have, starting all the way back then, some of the first visible elements. And then we know it existed before then. But this is when we first started seeing some of the visible evidence, um, visible to communities, even outside of the communities of practitioners. And so we soon began to be a just like I said, an incubator for healers, for traditions, and much of it passed on through families, which is a great insurer of tradition, as opposed to uh, people maybe going and getting initiated into a particular tradition. This tradition was remnant in families, and grandmothers taught mothers and daughters and fathers and sons. And so I would say uh, after these traditions took a foothold in Memphis, it became just part of the stream of consciousness. It was in the blood of families in Memphis, and so that tradition just continued to flourish. And along the way, we had those interactions from outsiders with it, which kind of leads us into another conversation. I'm sure we'll touch on with that.
Absolutely. Which so because there's quite a few places that we can go with what you just said. Thinking about the police, thinking about black folk, right? Before we go there, I wanted to ask you this, and you actually set it up by saying the port where they were bringing African prisoners of war was an indigenous sacred ground. Have you found any connection in the practice of hoodoo and or Pentecost between the two communities?
Well, it's interesting when we look at Memphis history. One of our more famous landmarks was a place, and it still is a place known as the St. Paul Spiritual Temple, and it's located around the Tennessee-Mississippi state line. And St. Paul Spiritual Temple gained this horrible nickname throughout the years as Voodoo Village.
Mm-hmm.
It had nothing to do with voodoo. And the St. Paul Spiritual Temple was actually a community, a temple that was started by a man named Wash Harris, Doc Harris. And Doc Harris was a spiritual healer. He was an artist, and he was a Freemason. And so when Doc Harris built his temple, he erected some really amazing works of art on his property. To the outsider, a lot of these more esoteric symbols look menacing. They look scary if it was something you had never encountered. Unfortunately, and this seemed to be the case with a lot of these clashes, over time, you would see outsiders to the community come in and vandalize the property. It became a sort of legend trip back in the day for guys to take their girls in high school out there and stop the car and listen to see if you could hear animals being killed or some sort of salacious violence, which was not happening there. But I say all this just to say, Doc Harris he had a saying in which he said, God showed the black man and the Indian something he didn't show the white man.
Mm.
And I think this really speaks to the perhaps camaraderie between traditions, particularly traditions of people in the diaspora. Of, look, you know what it's like to be taken from your land. You know what it's like to be stolen from your land, to be to have your land stolen. And so there was that camaraderie of sorts. And there are some very similar elements between some indigenous forms of healing and use of herbal remedies. And I think you would see some of these camaraderies in the Delta, where you would see what we would consider first American practices, very much right beside hoodoo related practices. So, not necessarily the same practice, but very similar, and a recognition uh, of you understand deity and we understand deity, and so that respect there.
I dig it. Now, I have to frame it this way. I'm just going to say it, particularly because you mentioned it a couple of times. So I'm not going to lead you. I'm just going to ask flat out, what and who are the outsiders we're talking about?
We are talking about people, typically the white community, typically the community that was either oppressing, enslaving, or just sitting on the sideline and doing nothing about all that. Um, you know, hoodoo would start being described in its earlier historical accounts as voodoo, and it wasn't in a respectful manner. It wasn't in speaking of the legitimate African traditions of Vodou, of Vodun. This was a pejorative that was used. Um, there was this fear you would constantly read about that Memphis was going to become little New Orleans. And we
Mm,
know that in New Orleans that slaves went crazy and they killed animals and they turned people into zombies and all this propaganda,
right.
to the point that in 1867 we had our first documented assault of a spiritual worker in Memphis, and the man that assaulted him said something to the effect that he knew he was going to New Orleans or that he was from New Orleans. And so this fear was already in the air. And I tell folks that come to the museum, um, we have to talk about race when we talk about hoodoo history. We have to talk about race, because not only is hoodoo obviously a tool of survival in the midst of racial oppression, but it also was framed in a way by its opposition from the get-go as being violent, evil, pagan. And that carried on through the years, and it built on through the years. And while it may have started in the 1800s as far as our earliest documentation, we see that all the way to today in 2026. And so a lot of that was born there when we first when folks first come into the museum. There is there's a famous photograph of Robert Johnson that we have on the wall. And the beautiful thing is, if you look out our window across the street, you can see the studio where that photograph was taken.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a beautiful historical connection there, but that opens the conversation for urban legends surrounding the crossroads and surrounding pop culture's use of images of the devil when we speak of Robert Johnson. And so we talk about the role of an important African deity such as Esu, and how even all the way up into 2026, that there are every year festivals held in Nigeria called Esu is Not Satan, the Esu is
Mm-hmm.
Not Satan Festival, because this early identification with this African deity by missionaries that came in and said, oh, that's the devil. That's a devil type figure. He's a trickster. He's Satan. That label stayed. And that label also migrated to other countries, to where now, when people would encounter images of Esu or talk of the worship of Esu, that people would say, oh, you mean the devil? That's
Right.
Satan. And so I think that translated, regardless of historically what happened with Robert Johnson, even just the stories of the crossroads being this quote evil place where you could sell your soul to the devil, I, culminated from a lot of that early propaganda about Esu and African traditions.
And I believe it was. And thank you for bringing up the Folklife Museum. I want to discuss that as well. But before we get there, and I still believe it was in stories of root workers and hoodoo in the Mid South. Not only some of the piece of New Orleans, but it was the idea of the AME Church
Mhm.
uh, trying to convert those that practice still. Could and I bring this up because there was assaults on the folk practice from police, from, like you said, pharmaceutical, different industries, but also I thought about it when you said there were black people that that are not aware of it. There were black people that were trying to antagonize the practice, the similar to the blues, where it was like, we don't want that backwoods stuff.
Mhm.
Could you talk to us about that a bit?
Yeah, there was a time in history where we started uh, with the, I guess, the public awareness of the tradition. We started seeing public campaigns against the tradition from a faith based approach. In fact, we've got a number of flyers that were advertisements for revivals around West Tennessee, and they would say things like, "Come and hear the dangers of root workers and conjurers. Um, uh, Come and hear how you can combat things having to do with voodoo, hoodoo, conjure." And so, you would hear from the pulpit these discussions and these messages. And so it was fascinating. It's always kind of ironic how you might have a church who's utilizing some very apparent African traditions of healing, but yet that same church would speak out against the tradition. Um, and I realize some of that may be how that particular worldview framed those practices in their view. But at the same time, again, we would see congregations who might have an issue with a mojo bag, but we're certainly okay with a prayer cloth.
Right.
So, you know,
Yes.
um, you saw this conflict. Um, uh, I know we had some cases. We had a couple of cases in Mississippi. I know of one specifically where there were clergy in this one particular congregation that wouldn't enter their church because there was a powder poured out around the church and inside the church, and there was this immediate fear of, we may not recognize the practices, but we fear what this is. And I feel like that contributed a lot to the propaganda against hoodoo, was this misunderstanding, was this fear. And it was a never ending battle, because you would have um, churches would speak against it, but then at the same time would show fear against it. And it's like, so you call it superstition, but yet you're scared of it.
Right. Right.
you know
Which,
so
which
but yeah, we did see that through the years.
and so you said you can't discuss this as a culture, as a tradition, or as an issue without discussing race. Um, what I wonder, and I'm going back to this because I don't want to set up any questions as if I'm singling anyone out, black, white, yellow, in between, or whatever. But I did kind of feel like I singled out the AME Church.
Mhm.
And I guess, to be fair, the following question would be: could the idea of missionaries that didn't have an understanding of the practice, Did you come across any of these kind of cases or stories or studies?
Yeah, in fact, there are some early accounts in Nigeria of where missionaries even sketched images of, say, a sacred space for Esu, and they would write, this is where the devil Esu lives, or this is
Wow.
where devil worship takes place in this particular grove or sacred space. You would hear accounts, much like some of the accounts that we would see. Um, One of the worst things that happened in regards to propaganda against African traditions in the West was when a man named William Seabrook wrote about voodoo practices in Haiti, and he pulled out all these salacious examples, and the illustrations in his book were, one of these horrible racist drawings of Haitians, and two, images of, oh, these were orgies, and this was, people were bloodthirsty, and this is what goes on in this religion and things like that. And so that really set the tone. That really set the tone for a lot of Hollywood depictions of African traditions, because they took it from that. And
Mhm.
so that's when we started seeing the zombies and the sticking pins and dolls and all the stuff we've seen in Hollywood through the years. But I say that just to say the writings of some of the early missionaries and encounters in Africa were very biased, were very tainted by ethnocentric views, where something may be very traditional and holy in a particular community. It was described as satanic, evil, basically a threat to society. And it's sad, but we watched this campaign starting in Africa. And that's when we start with Esu at the first of the museum and talk about this, how that sort of set a precedent of describing African traditions as evil, as demonic, as, a threat to society.
Okay, so apparently you've done this often because you give me so much material. I'm totally off sheet. I'm writing down notes. But there's a couple of things I want to ask before we get into fully get into the museum. Um, just because one, the idea of voodoo and hoodoo either being the same or being um in opposition. What is the relationship between the two? Let's start there.
So that is probably the number one question we get asked at the museum. Is hoodoo voodoo? Are they the same? Are they different? So there's a lot of variables to that. But my go-to answer, and it is the truth, is that African traditions of healing and spirituality are a tree. And that tree has many branches. And one you may see in the Congo, two you may see in Nigeria, you may see a different form in Cuba, you may see a different form in Detroit. These are different branches from the same tree, with African traditions being that root. And so we're talking about members of the same family.
Okay.
Now, when we get to using the word voodoo, we had to consider a couple of contexts. One, yes, the practices of voodoo and the practices of hoodoo have some similarities, but also have some differences. In voodoo, you have a uh, definite organized clergy, there's specific liturgy, there's specific levels of initiation, in which you don't always see in hoodoo tradition. The flip side, though, if you were born and raised in the South, and you were born and raised around hoodoo with hoodoo, you will many times hear people say, I'm using hoodoo to fight off voodoo. Miss Jessie used to tell us that strangers that came in to see her, when they left, she used to have to sprinkle flour and salt and different ingredients. She'd put them in a bag and cut the end of this plastic bag, much like when you're doing icing on a cake. And she would sprinkle it around the outside of her house. And she would say, that's because these people bring voodoo in and you have to keep voodoo off your property. And so in that perspective, that term was just used as sort of a malevolent thing. But then there's again another level of the actual traditions of whether it be West African voodoo, Haitian voodoo, whether it be Dominican voodoo, all these different approaches of voodoo that greatly differ than practices of hoodoo. But then you go some places and they're very much lined up. A lot of the same herbs, a lot of the same practices, particularly when we look at like New Orleans voodoo. You see those family members hanging out together. And so, but yeah, that's sort of where we go with that. And I think that's important as and then there's that other perspective of when we look at historical documentation of hoodoo practices in the Mid-South, we have to understand that typically when we saw the word voodoo in the press, that was synonymous with witchcraft, sorcery, bad things, according to the writers, according to the white community, that voodoo was the thing to fear, and that's what hoodoo was bad voodoo, and that was that perspective, you know.
Yeah. So hold on, let me stay on because I wanted to get to a couple of things. So before we get to the connection of hoodoo and Pentecost, Isu, and before we get to the crossroads, the idea of Papa Legba, Anansi, Ifa, how does this fit into this diasporic look at the practice?
It's interesting. One of the things that we talk about in the museum is some of the common elements we see in African traditions and African spiritual traditions. Things such as, and most importantly, the honoring of ancestors, the honoring of ancestral wisdom, the honoring of elders, the recognition of herbs, not only as a biological agent, but as a carrier of spiritual energies, the recognition of spirit in nature, the use of forms of divination, of inquiring about fate and inquiring about wisdom from particular deities or spirits. And so we see these common elements throughout, whether it be Ifa, whether it be a Luya religion in Kenya, whether we see among the Yoruba, in some of the different practices, these elements are there. These elements, these common elements are there. And so the thing with hoodoo, though, and I'm just speaking about in the Mid-South, hoodoo was not restricted to a particular religious tradition. That being said, you would have someone who may be Pentecostal, follow a Christian tradition. You find someone that may have come from a Muslim background that utilize different aspects of hoodoo. You may find someone from a Jewish tradition, someone from an African traditional religion. And so those practices were something that were fluid, that could be embraced by people from different faith traditions. And so it wasn't necessarily, this is hoodoo, this is my religion, this is all I do. So it became something very fluid, because it brings us back to the true intent, and that is survival. Because everyone needed survival. You know, we all need to survive, and so you know, it wasn't necessarily boxed in with one particular religious tradition.
Dig it, dig it. So now, as we get ready to shift into the uh, museum for the last segment of the interview, I want to. You brought up Robert Johnson and him before, recording there, and this idea of the crossroads, which we know is either Isu or it's Papa Legba or it's all of some entity,
Mm-hmm.
which usually is uh, called the devil or a demon, right?
Yeah, usually depicted.
Depicted, I should say.
Yeah, by pop
In-
culture, absolutely.
right. So, what I would like to ask, and then we can go into it, because there's so many uh, intersections with the blues and the spiritual belief, right? Just from what's being discussed, as in lyrics. But I think it serves a purpose to, before we even get to lyrics and different root work and things of this nature, the idea of an entity in the Black South that is the gateway between some unsuspecting person desiring better, right? And this entity, by some is depicted as a devil, but by others, this is a venerated entity that could be considered a trickster. Could you talk to us about that?
Yeah. You know, the what's really interesting is in some of Harry Middleton Hyatt's early documentation of interviews in Memphis, there's one interview where he speaks to a guy who's a musician, and this guy talks about going down to the crossroads at midnight and making a deal with his spirit. And it's not in a malevolent sounding way. It's just this is a spirit we're going to go interact with. And, you know, it's so, I think, I think personal worldview and the culture that you're raised around, the worldviews you're raised around really affects how you would see Esu or a
Mhm.
spirit of a crossroad. If you were raised in a Pentecostal family, maybe you were taught that that was the devil. Maybe if you were raised in a family that embraced a lot more African traditions, you might understand that's not who Esu is. I think that really differed according to the spiritual worldview of who was approaching that. Um, I also found it interesting that one of the books, one of the more recent books written about Robert Johnson from one of his family members, um, talks about her perceptions of his discussion of the crossroads leaned more toward some Christian concepts of the crossroads that were described in messages given by one particular minister in their church. And so I think there's a lot of approaches to that. And again, I think it depends on the ground those seeds are planted. If you share about this spirit of the crossroads and the ground comes from a very strict evangelical background, you may view that spirit in one manner. And so I think it just differed according to person.
I dig it. I dig it. And then, so with that being said, the ideas of Orishas, the ideas of witches and witchcraft.
Hmm.
Actually, we don't need to speak of Orishas because I think you kind of, uh, in a broader stroke, gave us a great idea of how all these things correlate to each other. But I would like you, before we go specific, and I keep saying this, but you mentioned witchcraft and these type of things being connected or accused of
Hmm.
being practiced and then there's also a idea of witchcraft and conjuring and root work being misconstrued.
Mhm.
So I guess the question I would like for you to address, if you will, what you know of witchcraft and warlock craft, and how was that even intersected with hoodoo or even voodoo?
So when we look at the use of the term witchcraft in in Mid-South hoodoo history, whether it be from those outside the tradition or those in the tradition, the term is a lot like we talked about how voodoo was. There were a lot of different perceptions. When we look at it from an outsider perspective, witchcraft, particularly from pop culture, is always has for the majority been presented as sorcery, as something bad, as something evil. That's from the outsider perspective, and immediately, the bottom line was when it came to historical perceptions about hoodoo in the Mid-South from those outside the tradition, it was always viewed as this is evil, this is witchcraft, but ultimately because this is black. I mean, that's the core of that. It wasn't the hoodoo, it wasn't the witchcraft. It was because of racism that this attack was there. Now, let me say this: you will hear among hoodoo traditional healers the talk of witchcraft in a manner in which it is a negative thing that's been done to someone. And we have to consider that coming from not only maybe a Christian worldview, but also from an African worldview. From in Africa, seeing malevolent sorcery being known as witchcraft, of when someone buries something on your lawn and your child gets sick, or someone um, does a particular working against your husband and he loses his job. Um, that in many cases is referred to as witchcraft. And then, of course, we have the reality of European witchcraft, of what we know as neo-pagan Wicca, that are very different than this concept of evil magic and doing harm to people. And so we've got all these perspectives about witchcraft floating around, but it was very much a feared concept in Memphis hoodoo history. And you would go to see someone to take something off you. You would go to see someone to remove whatever it is somebody crossed you with. And so, is very much a reality, a lot of different perspectives on it, but sort of a fluid use of it. And again, though, by the outsiders to the tradition, voodoo and witchcraft were both buzzwords that immediately said, this is evil, this is bad.
Yeah, and sorcery. These I guess you answered the question for me. The term, and I guess what I'm looking for is where did the terms come from? Sorcery, witchcraft, and the like. But you did answer what my initial question was. So and that'll be a whole. Go. What were we going to say?
I was just going to say, I mean, a lot of that, those specific terms um, are um, are European based labels.
Okay.
Um, in Africa, you may hear of witchcraft described by another term, but it's still inferring sorcery of sorts that someone has done. So it just depends on your particular the particular people you come from, the particular language that's used. But you will hear of sorcery, but maybe by a different term. But that specific terminology of witchcraft is definitely European based, and
Okay.
and as we know, some of that also probably came from early missionary interactions. One of the things that I do, not to get off track, but one of the things that I've done over the last number of years is do some work in advocacy in areas of Africa where there are still witch hunts and communities.
Mm-hmm.
We have seen what someone has described as what they call Frankenstein churches, where you may have a community that practices very traditional African traditions of spirituality and healing, but then all of a sudden you have this introduction of very extreme forms of Pentecostalism that has been brought in from the outside, and combined, we're seeing some dangerous mixes. I witnessed back in the early 2000s a child going through an exorcism in Kenya, and it was very traumatic for the child. But the child's mother said he has a spirit called epilepsy, and that is what they were viewing as this demonic manifestation, according to this group she had connected with. And so, while that was a horrible, traumatic thing for that child, we're seeing even worse cases where elderly are being burned to death, where children are being tortured. And it's all under the guise of, an African tradition of spirituality may say, we're going to lay hands on this child, or we're going to pray over this child, or we're going to combat this spiritually. With this new influx of teachings, there is this physical violence. And it's a horrible, horrible thing, but it's a difference between approaching perceived threats, either spiritually or physically and violently. And so, that sort of brings us back around to what we're talking here as far as perceptions of witchcraft and sorcery.
Yeah, 1000%. And again, you definitely answered both levels of that question. So now, as we bring it to the close, let's bring it fully. And mind you, you've throughout the discussion gave us these answers, but I want to ask you directly and just let you have at it for the audience's sake to talk to us about the Beale Street Hoodoo History and Folklife Museum, and why Folklife?
Because Hoodoo history embraces folk life, embraces daily living. Some perceptions of Hoodoo is that some practices are done, all of a sudden I want to go to the casino, or all of a sudden I need to find a man, or I need to find a woman, and now I'm gonna all of a sudden use this tradition. The truth is, the tradition is part of daily life. The truth is, it permeates every aspect of life, from work to daily life at home, to family life. And so I think it was, and I think it is very important that in trying to communicate the importance of the tradition historically, that we communicate that this is not, as Hollywood or even some internet websites make us believe, that it's, hey, when you want to do a quick spell, when you want to curse somebody, when you want to do this, just latch on to this practice. That no, this is a tradition. This is a historical lineage, that the practices that were utilized in Africa, that were founded in Africa, were for daily life, not just all of a sudden somebody, hey, all of a sudden I want to pop a John the Conqueror root in my pocket because I want to go get a lottery ticket.
Right.
And so that's why I feel like that's the importance of the folk life aspect of it. And the museum, like I had said, we started out as a traveling museum with some stuff. As time went on, working with the folks there at A. Schwab, it became very apparent how important that store, that street, Beale Street, and the city, Memphis, how important hoodoo has been to the survival of families over the years in the city. And so we've got all this beautiful history that has been there that we just hadn't talked about. We haven't showcased and featured and drawn attention to. And, you know, if I may speak real quick to the aspect of race, we talked about race. Let me give you this summary of Memphis hoodoo history and race real quick. So in the beginning, we heard stories about how in the papers in Memphis that hoodoo was superstition. That there were even reports of hoodoo practitioners on St. John's Eve are going to come into your house and steal blue-eyed, blonde-haired babies. So lock your windows up. All this kind of propaganda. Again, race-based, race-based, race-based. Look at what the Black community is doing. Look at the horrible thing the Black community is doing. And so there came a point in time where we started, as far as the outsiders to the community, started hearing some murmurs of some things. Harry Middleton Hyatt interviewed a lady named Madame Collins that lived not far from Beale Street. You could throw a rock and just about hit her house from where she lived. And Madame Collins revealed to him something that was very telling. And she said, do you realize the majority of my clients as a spiritual reader, majority of my clients are white? Well, that was kind of telling. So not long after that, there was a lady that lived in I think it was in East Memphis, named Mary Grady. And Mary Grady was a very well-to-do white lady. Her husband was a businessman. They owned a pool hall. Mary Grady fell in love with a cab driver who happened to be Black. Mm-hmm. They were seeing each other privately. And at one point, he broke things off with her. And he basically said, look, here's the thing. If we're caught, I could be killed. We can't do this. I could be killed. Well, she didn't believe that that's why he was breaking things off with him. So it said, it's documented that she went to a spiritual reader. And the spiritual reader said, there's a lady named Isabella Walton who lives in downtown Memphis. She's a young Black lady. That's who's messing with your man. Now, why she picked this name, I don't know if she had a history with this person or whatever. Mary Grady goes to Isabella Walton and shoots Isabella Walton. Wow. When this case goes to court, the shock to the community isn't that an innocent woman was shot. The shock to the community is, I can't believe this white woman is having an interracial romance.
Right. Right.
And so that started cracking open some folks' perceptions of, wait a minute, well, if this is superstitious or this is evil, why are members of the white community going to it now? And so race has always played a big part in the history of hoodoo in Memphis. And so with the museum, one of the things we want to do, I tell my friends who are in the tradition, look, this museum is for you, but it's also not for you. It's for you in respect. It's for the elders that we want to show recognition and respect to in this tradition. But you know what? It's also for the guy who comes off the street from Cleveland, Ohio, and goes, I've heard of hoodoo. Is that stuff, the dolls and the sticking pins and dolls and the evil stuff? That's who it's for. And, you know, it's amazing to watch, almost like the scales drop from some folks' eyes by the end of giving them a tour and talking about what hoodoo is, what hoodoo was, and the uh, myths about the tradition. And so that's why we have the museum. That's and the museum is uh, it's self funded. It's I don't get paid for it. I just do it because I feel like it's important. I feel like it is something um, that is important to us as humanity. I think it's something it's important um, to Black Memphians. Um, I think it's in something that's important that we preserve. And it's amazing once you start becoming familiar with the tradition. You start seeing things, artifacts, writings, photographs that speak to it. We actually found there was a spiritual healer on Beale Street, uh, Dr. William Warren, Professor Warren, they called him. And Professor Warren was an amazing guy. He was a spiritual healer. He started an organization that actually gave food to the impoverished, actually held classes on maintaining your finances, pardon me, for the community. But yet in the papers, he was labeled as a cult leader.
Mm.
We actually found a birthday invitation from Dr. William Warren to Mr. Schwab, who started A. Schwab's. And it's beautiful because this postcard that has the invitation on it, it has a picture of Dr. Warren looking at a superimposed picture of Dr. Warren.
Mm.
And it says at the bottom, "Me speaking to my conscious." And it's beautiful to see because you know the context of what that is.
Right.
And you know the importance of that as a historical document. And so we need to preserve that. We need to preserve and teach from that. And I'm always encouraged when I have folks bring their children into the museum and walk through and see it's things they don't have to be scared of. See it's things that may be part of their historical lineage, or if not, just something that you don't have to fear. So that's sort of been the aim of the museum and what we do there.
Man, well, I definitely appreciate your time explaining all of this stuff and your patience because we've been trying to get this discussion together for a moment now.
Yeah, that's all right. Life happens, man.
That is true. Let the good people know where to find you and the museum, times of operations and social medias, all that good stuff.
Sure. Our website is at hoodoomuseum.org. And so it's pretty easy to find. You can find me on Facebook under Memphis Hoodoo, and on X as Memphis Hoodoo for now. But that's most likely where we're going to be online. And the museum, we're open Monday through. We're open Monday. We're open every day but Saturday. Let me put it that way. We're open Monday through Friday, and then on Sundays. And we're open from 1 to 4. And you can always contact me if you might want to visit, and it's not during those times. I curate another museum, and then I teach, and so I'm only available, certain hours, unfortunately. But on Mondays, I do tours, and we do events. Try to do an event every month, if not every other month. Last month we showed a documentary, the Voodoo Healer, that was from our friends with the Soul of Africa Museum out of Germany, and then we'll be having some upcoming events throughout the year. We've got some folks from the Hoodoo community that are going to come do some demonstrations, some talks, and we just want to invite folks in to learn and to share what they learn.
Very groovy. You know, we're planning on when we in that when you're neck of the woods, we definitely want to come by and take a look.
I want you to be there, man. Absolutely.
Groovy. Thank you. Good folk, you heard it here. As I always say, check out the museum, check out the books too. And you know, if just continue practicing. I don't know what else to say after that.
Well, I know definitely